Elena Marsh felt the eyes of the entire pack on her back before she even understood why. The great hall of Silver Ridge had gone silent, and that silence pressed against her skin like a hand pushing her down. She had walked into the coronation hoping to disappear into the crowd, but something in the air had shifted the moment Kalen Voss lifted his head and looked straight at her. His eyes changed color. She saw it happen, a flash of pale gold sweeping across his irises, there and gone in an instant, like a spark that refused to become a fire. The whole hall saw it too. A murmur rolled through the crowd of wolves in their formal clothes, a murmur that carried a single word she did not yet understand. Mate. Elena did not know what that word meant to these people, not fully, not yet. She had come to Silver Ridge only 3 days earlier, delivered by a courier from a pack far to the north, sent to serve as a temporary aid for the coronation preparations. She was not one of them. She had no rank, no family name that meant anything within these walls, no claim to standing in a room full of alphas and betas dressed in silver and black. She was, by every measure that mattered here, no one. And yet Kalen Voss, the man about to be crowned Alpha King of one of the strongest packs in the region, was staring at her as if she were the only person in the hall. For one heartbeat, she thought he might cross the room. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and something raw and open moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. She felt her own breath catch without permission, her heart lifting toward a stranger for no reason she could explain. Then his face closed like a door. He turned away from her, not slowly, not with any hesitation that the crowd could read as uncertainty, but with the clean, deliberate motion of a king who had already decided what kind of ruler he intended to be. He walked to the dais where the pack elders waited with the crown, and he never looked back. The murmur in the hall changed tone. What had been a ripple of surprise became something sharper, something closer to pity, aimed directly at her. Elena felt heat rush into her face. She did not understand every custom of wolf society, but she understood humiliation when she felt it settle over her like a wet coat. An older woman near her, dressed in deep blue robes that marked her as one of the healers, leaned close and whispered, "He rejected you." In front of everyone. Rejected me from what? Elena asked, her voice barely a thread of sound. The healer's eyes were sad. From being his mate, child. The bond just formed between you. Right there, in front of the whole pack. And he refused it. Elena did not fully understand what a bond was, not the way these people understood it, deep in their blood and their instincts, but she understood rejection. She understood the particular sting of being chosen by fate and refused by the person fate had chosen. She stood very still while the coronation continued around her, while Kalen Voss knelt to receive the crown of Silver Ridge, while the pack roared its approval for their new Alpha King, and she felt entirely, completely alone, in a room full of celebrating strangers. She left before the ceremony ended, slipping out through a side door into the cool evening air. The castle grounds stretched before her, dark stone walls rising against a purple sky, torches lighting long stone paths between gardens she had not yet learned to navigate. She walked without any real destination, just trying to put distance between herself and the sound of cheering that still drifted from the hall behind her. She did not get far. "You should not be out here alone," a voice said from the shadow of a garden wall. Elena spun around, startled, and found a young man watching her with careful, kind eyes. He wore the uniform of the castle guard, though the coronation night had clearly given him leave from formal duty, since his jacket hung open and his collar was loose. "I needed air," she said simply. "I heard what happened in the hall," he admitted, stepping closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "News travels fast in a place this small. I am sorry, that was a cruel thing to witness." "I do not even know what it means," Elena said, and to her own surprise, her voice cracked slightly on the words. "Everyone looked at me like I had been struck down in front of them." "In a way, you were," he said gently. "My name is Desmond. I am one of the border guards here, and for what it is worth, I do not think anyone in that hall believes what the Alpha King did was kind." Something about his easy honesty loosened the tight knot in Elena's chest. She managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Desmond. I am Elena." "I know," he said, and when she raised an eyebrow, he laughed softly. Everyone in the castle knows by now. Word moves faster than wind around here. They walked together for a while, and Desmond pointed out small things about the grounds, the old fountain that had not worked properly in a decade, the training yard where recruits sparred at dawn, the kitchen garden where the castle's best cook grew herbs that made the whole east wing smell like rosemary in summer. It was such a small, ordinary conversation, and yet it felt like the first true kindness Elena had been shown since arriving at Silver Ridge. She did not notice the figure standing at a high window above the garden, watching her walk beside another man with his hands curled into fists at his sides. Kalen Voss stood alone in his new private chambers, still dressed in the ceremonial black and silver of his coronation, and stared down at the garden where his mate walked with a stranger, laughing softly at something the young guard had said. His claws had lengthened without his permission, sharp points pressing into his palms hard enough to draw thin lines of blood. He did not stop them. The pain gave him something to focus on, besides the roaring instinct clawing at the inside of his chest, screaming at him to go down there, to put himself between Elena Marsh and every other man in the world. He had rejected the bond. He had done it on purpose, in front of the whole pack, knowing exactly what it would cost her in the eyes of the wolves who now called him king. He had seen the hurt cross her face before she managed to hide it, and it had taken every ounce of discipline he possessed not to cross that hall and take it all back. But he could not take it back, not without putting her in more danger than she could possibly imagine. His advisor, Silas, appeared in the doorway without knocking, as he always did, a privilege earned through decades of loyal service to the Voss family. Silas took one look at the scene through the window and sighed. "You are going to make yourself sick standing here," Silas said. "I am fine," Kalen said, though his voice was rough. "You rejected your mate in front of the entire pack on your coronation night," Silas said, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of a man who had known Kalen since he was a pup learning to walk on 4 legs. "There will be talk. There is already talk. And now I find you watching her from a window, like a man who cannot decide whether he made the right choice." "I made the only choice I could," Kalen said. "You know what is coming, Silas. You know what the Drake pack has sworn to do to any confirmed mate of the Voss bloodline. If I claim her, I paint a target on her back that no wall in this castle can protect against." Silas was quiet for a moment. "And if you do not claim her, you paint a different kind of target. A woman with no pack, no protection, and no rank, wandering this castle, while every wolf in it whispers that the Alpha King rejected her. Do you think that keeps her safe, Kalen? Or does it simply make her an easier person to reach?" Kalen said nothing, because he had no good answer. Down in the garden, Elena laughed again at something Desmond said, and the sound traveled all the way up to the window, bright and warm, and utterly unaware of the storm it caused in the man watching from above. "I will assign extra guards to her quarters," Kalen said finally, his voice flat, controlled, the voice of a king rather than a man. Quietly, "She does not need to know. And when she asks why every guard in the castle seems to be watching her, she will not ask," Kalen said, "because she will not know it is me." Silas studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that made Kalen feel like the small child Silas had once carried on his shoulders through these very halls. "You cannot protect a person by hiding from them, Kalen. Sooner or later, that always breaks." "Then it breaks later," Kalen said, and turned away from the window before he could watch Elena disappear around the garden path, with Desmond still at her side, still making her laugh, still doing effortlessly the one thing Kalen had just convinced himself he could never allow himself to do. That night, Elena was given a room in the east wing of the castle, a modest space with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a single window that looked out over the same gardens she had walked through with Desmond. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the maid left her alone, turning over everything the healer had told her in the hall. A bond, mates, rejection, words that belonged to a world she had only just stepped into, a world with rules she did not know, and consequences she was only beginning to feel. She thought of the way Kalen Voss had looked at her for that single heartbeat, before turning away, the flash of gold in his eyes, the way his face had gone from open to closed so fast it felt like watching a door slam shut on purpose. She told herself it did not matter. She was here to help with the coronation preparations, and would likely be reassigned elsewhere within a few weeks, once Silver Ridge no longer needed extra hands. She did not need to understand wolf bonds or mate rejections. She did not need to think about the strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the humiliation of being rejected in public, and everything to do with the look on his face just before he turned away, a look that had seemed, for one impossible second, like grief. She was still awake when she heard soft footsteps pause outside her door, followed by low voices she could not quite make out. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, catching only fragments. Double the watch on this hall. His Majesty's orders, no questions. She is not to know. Elena stepped back from the door, her pulse quickening. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood enough to know that something about her presence in this castle mattered far more than anyone had told her, and that the man who had rejected her in front of his entire pack was, for reasons she could not begin to guess, not nearly as indifferent to her as he wanted everyone, including her, to believe. She lay awake long after the footsteps faded, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since arriving at Silver Ridge, she found herself wondering not whether she would be sent away soon, but what exactly she had walked into, and whether the coldest man she had ever met was hiding something far warmer and far more dangerous behind those closed doors of his. Elena woke to the sound of a maid setting a tray of tea on her writing desk, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the coronation hall returned, sharp and unwelcome, and she sat up with a small, tired sigh. "Good morning, miss," the maid said. Her name was Ivy, a young beta with a round, friendly face and quick hands. "His Majesty has asked that you be given quarters closer to the royal wing. I am to help you move your things this morning." Elena blinked. Closer to the royal wing? Why? Ivy shrugged, though something knowing flickered in her eyes. "Pack law, miss. Unmated Omegas under the Crown's protection are required to live within reach of the Royal Guard. It is an old rule, from a time when packs fought more often than they do now. I imagine His Majesty is simply following tradition." Elena did not believe that explanation for a single second, not after the whispered voices outside her door the night before, but she said nothing, and let Ivy help her gather her few belongings. Within an hour, she found herself installed in a much larger room down the same hall as the Alpha King's private chambers, close enough that she could hear muffled voices through the walls at odd hours, close enough that she passed 2 guards stationed outside her new door every single time she stepped into the corridor. She told herself this was simply castle procedure. She told herself the way her new window looked directly across the courtyard at Kalen's own window meant nothing at all. Kalen, for his part, made certain their paths did not cross except when absolutely required. He greeted her with cool formality whenever pack business forced them into the same room, addressing her the way he might address any visiting aide, polite and utterly without warmth. Elena found the coldness almost more disorienting than the rejection itself. A person who truly did not care would not need to work so hard at appearing indifferent. She noticed small things. The guards outside her door changed shifts more frequently than the guards outside any other quarters in the East Wing, as though someone wanted fresh, alert eyes on her at all times. The kitchen staff always seemed to know her preferences before she voiced them, her tea arriving exactly the way she liked it, though she had never told anyone her preference. When a sudden storm rolled through the mountains one evening, extra wood appeared outside her door for her fireplace, before she had even thought to ask for it. None of it was traceable back to Kalen directly. Every kindness arrived through some intermediary, some servant or guard following orders that were never explained. But Elena was not a foolish woman, and she began to notice the pattern, even as she pretended, mostly to herself, that she had not. "You are staring at his window again," Ivy said one afternoon, catching Elena at her own window with a book unread in her lap. Elena startled, closing the book quickly. "I was not staring at anything. I was reading." Ivy gave her a look that suggested she believed nothing of the sort but was too polite to argue. "He is a hard man to understand, His Majesty. My grandmother used to say, the Voss men love like they fight, all in or not at all, and they would rather bleed alone than admit they are bleeding." That is a strange thing to say about a man who rejected his own mate in front of the entire pack, Elena said, more sharply than she intended. Ivy's expression softened. I know it does not make sense from the outside, miss. But I have worked in this castle since I was a girl, and I have never seen the Alpha King order guards to change shift patterns for anyone the way he has for you. Whatever he says in public, his actions in private tell a different story. Elena did not know what to do with that information, so she tucked it away and tried to focus on her actual work, helping the castle's steward organize records left disorganized during the transition of power from the old Alpha King, Kalen's father, to Kalen himself. It was tedious work, sorting old ledgers and correspondence, but it kept her hands busy and her mind, mostly, away from thoughts of gold-flashing eyes and a door slamming shut on a look of grief. It was during this work that she first met Desmond again properly, this time in daylight, when he arrived at the steward's office to deliver a set of Border Patrol reports. He greeted her with the same easy warmth from the coronation night, and within minutes, they were laughing together over some small mishap involving a misfiled inventory of grain stores that had somehow been recorded twice, doubling the castle's apparent supply of wheat on paper, while the actual stores remained exactly the same. The old steward must have been counting his lunch as inventory, Desmond said, grinning, and Elena laughed so hard she had to set down her pen. She did not see the shadow that passed the office doorway at that exact moment, did not see Kalen pause mid-stride, his hand tightening on the doorframe of the corridor outside, his jaw working as he listened to the sound of her laughter carry through the open door. He did not go in. He told himself there was no reason to go in, that whatever business the steward's office had with Border Patrol reports was not his concern as king, that a man in his position had far more important matters demanding his attention than the sound of his rejected mate laughing with a border guard. He told himself all of this while standing frozen in the corridor for nearly a full minute, before finally forcing his feet to carry him away. That evening, he summoned the captain of the guard to his private study. I want Desmond Hale reassigned, Kalen said, without preamble, staring into the fireplace rather than at the captain. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Nolan who had served under Kalen's father before him, raised an eyebrow. Reassigned where, Your Majesty? He is one of our better men, steady, well-liked, good instincts on the border. The Eastern Ridge post is undermanned, Kalen said. Send him there, effective tomorrow. Nolan studied his king for a long moment, and Kalen could feel the weight of that gaze even without looking up. Is there a problem with Hale's conduct, Your Majesty? No, Kalen said, too quickly. Then may I ask what prompted this? Kalen finally looked up, and something in his expression must have warned Nolan that the conversation had reached its limit, because the old captain simply nodded and said, As you wish, Your Majesty. I will see it done. After Nolan left, Kalen sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at the flames, trying to convince himself that reassigning a good soldier to a distant post had nothing to do with the sound of a woman's laughter drifting through an open office door, and knowing, even as he tried, that he was lying to himself in a way he had never lied to anyone else in his entire life. Elena learned of Desmond's transfer 2 days later, when she stopped by the steward's office hoping to share another laugh over some new administrative disaster, and found a different guard delivering the border reports instead. Where is Desmond? She asked. Reassigned to the Eastern Ridge, miss, the new guard said. Word came down from the captain himself. Sudden thing, if you ask me. He only found out yesterday morning. Elena felt an odd chill settle over her, though she could not have said exactly why. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Guards were reassigned all the time, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. It was probably nothing at all. But as she walked back to her quarters that evening, past the ever-present guards outside her door, past the window that faced Kalen's own, she found herself thinking about Ivy's words, about a man who loved like he fought, all in or not at all, and she wondered, for the first time with real unease, whether the distance the Alpha King kept from her was not indifference at all, but something far more complicated, and far more dangerous to the men who dared to stand too close to her. Weeks passed at Silver Ridge, and Elena settled into a rhythm she had not expected to find in a place that had greeted her with such public humiliation. Her work with the steward expanded into managing correspondence for minor pack matters, trade agreements with neighboring territories, requests for aid from smaller settlements under Silver Ridge protection. She found she was good at it, quick with numbers and careful with words, and the steward began to rely on her more each week. She also found, without quite meaning to, that she had made friends within the castle walls despite her outsider status. Ivy remained a steady, warm presence, always ready with gossip and tea in equal measure. The castle cook, a broad-shouldered man named Oren, took a liking to her after she complimented his rosemary bread with such sincerity that he began setting aside the first warm loaf for her every morning. Even some of the guards who had initially eyed her with suspicion, wondering what an outsider was doing so close to the royal wing, had softened toward her once they saw how hard she worked and how little she complained. What she did not have, despite everything, was any real understanding of Kalen Voss. He remained a puzzle she turned over in quiet moments, a man who could dismiss her with cool formality in the Great Hall, and then, according to castle rumor, quietly authorize extra funds for a healer to treat a stable hand's sick child without ever mentioning it publicly. A man who had rejected her in front of his entire pack, and yet, she was fairly certain now, had personally ordered every man who grew close to her reassigned, dismissed, or sent to some distant post within days of showing her any real kindness. It had happened 3 times now. First Desmond, sent to the Eastern Ridge, then a young delegate's son visiting from a neighboring pack, who had spent one pleasant afternoon showing Elena how to properly care for a hawk in the castle's small aviary, only to be recalled home early by his father under circumstances no one could quite explain. Most recently, a stable hand named Tobias, who had taught Elena how to braid a horse's mane while telling her funny stories about his childhood, had been quietly transferred to manage the outer pastures, a demotion in all but name. Elena began to test the pattern deliberately, though she told herself she was simply curious, nothing more. She spent an afternoon in the training yard, watching the younger recruits spar, laughing genuinely at the enthusiastic but clumsy technique of a recruit named Fenwick, who kept tripping over his own feet. 2 days later, Fenwick was reassigned to kitchen duty, a posting he clearly found humiliating, given how red his ears turned when Elena passed him scrubbing pots in the corridor. That was enough proof for her. She marched to Kalen's study that same evening, brushing past the startled guards stationed at his door, with a determination that surprised even herself. She found him seated behind his desk, a stack of reports before him, his sleeves rolled up in a rare moment of informality. He looked up, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like relief at seeing her, before it vanished behind his usual careful mask. "Elena, is something wrong?" "You know exactly what is wrong," she said, closing the door behind her with more force than strictly necessary. "Fenwick, Tobias, Desmond, the delegate's son whose name I never even learned before he vanished. Every single man who has been kind to me in this castle has been reassigned, demoted, or sent away within days. I want to know why." Kalen set down his pen with deliberate care, his expression carefully neutral. "Pack reassignments are a matter of internal management, Elena. They are not something I discuss with outside aides." "Do not do that," Elena said, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to stay calm. "Do not hide behind titles and formality with me. You rejected me in front of your entire pack. You barely speak to me except when pack business forces you to. And yet you seem to have appointed yourself the guardian of every friendship I attempt to make in this castle. Which is it, Kalen? Do you care, or do you not?" Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, gold bleeding briefly into the dark brown, there and gone the way it had been at the coronation. His hands, resting on the desk, curled slowly into fists. "I do not owe you an explanation for how I manage my own pack," he said, and his voice had gone low and rough, a voice that seemed to cost him something to keep steady. "You owe me the truth," Elena shot back. "You made a choice that humiliated me in front of hundreds of people, and now you seem determined to make sure I have no one else in this castle to turn to. If that is not control, Kalen, then explain to me what it is." For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth behind him, and the silence stretched thin enough that Elena thought she could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. She watched something war behind his eyes, some private battle she could not name, and for just a heartbeat she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Then his jaw tightened, and the moment passed. "There is nothing to explain," he said, his voice flat and final. "I would ask that you return to your quarters. It is late." Elena felt something inside her chest crack, not from grief this time, but from a frustration so sharp it nearly stole her breath. She had come here hoping for honesty, or at least some acknowledgement that her feelings mattered, and instead, she had received the same cold wall he presented to the rest of the pack. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "Keep your secrets, Your Majesty, but do not pretend you are indifferent to me while you quietly rearrange the lives of every person who dares to make me smile. That is not indifference. I do not know what it is, but it is not that." She left before he could respond, though she thought, just as the door closed behind her, that she heard him say her name, low and rough, as though the word had escaped him against his will. Kalen sat alone in his study, long after she had gone, staring at the closed door, his knuckles white where his hands still gripped the edge of his desk. She was right, of course. She had seen through his careful distance with a clarity that terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced on a battlefield. He had told himself the reassignments were about protection, keeping potential targets away from her, reducing the number of people the Drake pack might exploit to reach her. But some deeper, more honest part of him knew that logic did not fully explain the way his blood had burned with something close to fury every time he heard her laugh at another man's joke, every time he watched her smile at someone who was not him. He had rejected the bond to protect her. He had told himself that so many times over the past weeks that it had become a kind of prayer, a justification he clung to whenever the guilt threatened to overwhelm him. But sitting alone in his study now, staring at the space where she had stood only moments before, radiating a hurt and anger he had caused, he wondered whether he was protecting her at all, or simply protecting himself from the terror of admitting how completely she had already claimed a piece of him he had never intended to give away. Silas found him there an hour later, still seated in the dark. The fire burned down to embers. "You told her nothing," Silas said. "It was not a question." "There was nothing to tell," Kalen said. Silas sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had watched a stubborn boy grow into an even more stubborn king. "You are going to lose her, Kalen. Not to the Drake pack, not to some enemy across the border. You are going to lose her to your own silence, one reassigned guard at a time, until she stops wondering why you push everyone away and simply accepts that you never cared at all." "Better that than the alternative," Kalen said quietly. "Is it?" Silas asked. "Because from where I am standing, the alternative is a woman who might have loved you, standing in your castle, growing more certain every day that you are exactly the cold, careless king you pretend to be. I am not sure that is a better outcome for anyone, least of all you." Kalen did not answer. He simply stared into the dying fire, and somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, Elena Marsh lay awake staring at her ceiling, wondering the very same thing. The Pack Unity Ball arrived 3 weeks later, an annual event meant to strengthen ties between Silver Ridge and its neighboring territories. Delegates from a dozen packs traveled to the castle for the occasion, filling the great hall with unfamiliar faces, foreign accents, and the particular tension that came from packs who were technically allies, but had spent centuries competing for territory and resources. Elena had not planned to attend. As an outside aide with no official pack standing, she assumed the ball was well beyond the reach of her duties. But Ivy insisted, arriving at her quarters that afternoon with an armful of deep green fabric and a determined expression. "His Majesty's steward has requested you attend to help manage the guest correspondence," Ivy said, though something in her tone suggested this explanation was only half the story. "And even if that were not true, miss, I refuse to let you spend another evening alone in this room while the whole castle celebrates downstairs." Elena allowed herself to be dressed, allowed Ivy to pin her hair into some elegant style she would never have managed alone, and told herself firmly that she was attending purely as a matter of duty. She did not admit, even to herself, the small flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of an evening away from the quiet tension that had settled over her interactions with Kalen since their confrontation in his study. The great hall, when she entered it, took her breath away. Silver banners hung from the rafters, catching the light of 100 candles. Musicians played from a raised platform, and the floor had been cleared for dancing, already filled with couples moving through unfamiliar but graceful steps. Elena found herself a quiet corner near the correspondence table, intending to simply observe the festivities from a comfortable distance. She lasted perhaps 20 minutes before a visiting alpha from a neighboring territory, a tall man with an easy smile, named Garrett Cole, approached her table with 2 glasses of spiced wine and an invitation to dance that was somehow both bold and perfectly charming. "I promise I am not nearly as intimidating as I look," Garrett said, setting 1 glass in front of her. "Though I understand why an outsider might be cautious in a room full of alphas she has never met." Elena laughed despite herself, disarmed by his easy humor. "You are very confident for a man I have known for exactly 10 seconds. Confidence is the only advantage a visiting alpha has in someone else's territory," Garrett said, grinning. "That, and a genuine appreciation for a woman who does not seem impressed by titles. May I have this dance, Elena Marsh?" She should have declined. Some instinct, buried beneath the pleasant warmth of his attention, whispered that accepting was unwise. But she was tired, she realized. Tired of watching her own life shrink around the careful distance Kaylin maintained. Tired of wondering why every friendly face in the castle seemed to vanish within days of befriending her. Tired of shaping her entire existence around a man who refused to explain himself. She wanted, for one evening, to simply enjoy herself. She accepted. Garrett proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the unfamiliar steps with patient good humor, making her laugh at his self-deprecating jokes about his own clumsy attempts to learn the very same dance as a boy. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt something close to lightness settle over her, the simple pleasure of a pleasant evening with a charming stranger who wanted nothing more complicated from her than her company. Across the hall, Kaylin stood near the dais, engaged in what should have been an important conversation with a visiting delegate about grain trade agreements, and heard none of it. His entire attention had narrowed to a single point on the dance floor, to the sight of Elena laughing at something Garrett Cole had said, her hand resting easily in his. Her whole face lit up in a way Kaylin had not seen directed at anyone since the night of the coronation, when it had briefly, impossibly, been directed at him. His wineglass cracked in his grip. He did not notice until a thin line of red wine trickled over his knuckles, mixing with a shallow cut where the glass had bitten into his skin. "Your Majesty," the delegate said, alarmed, "you are bleeding." "It is nothing," Kaylin said, his voice tight, his eyes never leaving the dance floor. Silas appeared at his side within moments, having watched the entire scene unfold from across the hall, with the weary resignation of a man who had seen this particular storm building for weeks. "Kaylin," he said quietly, using the familiar name rather than the formal title, a warning in itself. "Whatever you are about to do, I would strongly advise against it." "I am not going to do anything," Kaylin said, though his voice carried none of the conviction the words were meant to hold. He crossed the hall before Silas could stop him, weaving through dancing couples with the kind of controlled, deliberate movement that made several delegates step quickly out of his path, sensing something in his expression that warned them not to interfere. He arrived at the edge of the dance floor just as the music shifted, just as Garrett spun Elena in a graceful turn that brought her, laughing, back into his arms. "Cole," Kaylin said, his voice carrying easily over the music, cutting through the festive noise of the hall like a blade. Garrett turned, still smiling, though something more cautious entered his expression at the sight of the Alpha King's face. "Your Majesty, a wonderful celebration. I need to discuss a matter of territory with you," Kaylin said. "Now." Elena felt the shift in the air immediately, the way conversations nearby quieted, the way several nearby wolves turned to watch with poorly concealed interest. "Kaylin, we were only dancing," she said, her voice low and urgent. "This does not concern you, Elena," Kaylin said, and though his voice remained level, something in his eyes when he glanced at her briefly was anything but calm. Garrett, to his credit, kept his composure, though his easy smile had faded into something more wary. "If there is a territorial concern, Your Majesty, I would be glad to discuss it properly, through the appropriate channels, at a more suitable time." "Now would be more suitable," Kaylin said. "Your pack's border patrols have been crossing into Silver Ridge territory along the northern ridge for the past 2 months. I am formally challenging your right to continue those patrols. A duel, tomorrow at dawn, to settle the boundary dispute properly, as our laws allow." A stunned silence spread outward from the small circle around them, rippling through the hall as the news traveled from wolf to wolf, faster than any herald could have announced it. Elena stared at Kalen in open disbelief, and beneath the shock, a slow, dawning understanding began to take root. She did not know the specifics of the boundary he claimed had been violated. She was fairly certain, watching the tight, controlled fury in his expression, that this challenge had absolutely nothing to do with territory at all. "Kalen," she said again, quieter this time, urgent, "do not do this." He looked at her then, and for just a moment the mask slipped entirely, revealing something raw and desperate beneath the careful control, something that looked almost like a plea for her to understand what he could not bring himself to say aloud in front of the entire assembled hall. "I have already decided," he said quietly, and then, louder, to Garrett, "Dawn, at the training grounds. I trust you will not decline a formal challenge, Cole." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head with the stiff formality of a man who understood he had no honorable way to refuse. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The music resumed after a moment, awkward and uncertain, but the festive spirit of the ball had shattered entirely. Elena stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, watching Kalen turn and walk away without another word, and felt something twist painfully in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but some tangled combination of both, wrapped around a growing certainty that she understood, at last, exactly what was driving the Alpha King's cold, controlled cruelty, even if she could not yet begin to guess why he refused to simply say it aloud. Elena did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching the courtyard below, until the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, and then she pulled a cloak over her shoulders and made her way down to the training grounds, unwilling to simply wait in her room while whatever was about to happen, happened without her. A small crowd had already gathered by the time she arrived, pack elders and curious wolves standing in a loose circle around a cleared patch of packed earth, their breath fogging in the cold morning air. Garrett Cole stood on one side, stripped of his formal ball attire, and dressed instead in simple training clothes, his expression grim but composed. Across from him, Kalen waited with the same careful stillness Elena had come to recognize as the mask he wore whenever he was working hardest to control himself. Silas found her at the edge of the crowd, his expression troubled. "You should not be here, Elena." "I am not leaving," she said firmly. Silas studied her for a moment, then simply nodded, as though he had expected exactly this response, and had no real intention of arguing against it. The rules of the duel were explained briefly by one of the pack elders, formal and grave, emphasizing that this was a contest of honor, meant to settle a dispute, not a fight to the death, though Elena noted with some unease that the elder's tone suggested such distinctions were not always perfectly maintained, once two alphas actually began to fight. The duel began. Elena had never witnessed anything like it before, two powerful men circling each other with a controlled intensity that felt almost like a dance, testing each other's guard, exchanging quick, sharp exchanges that ended as fast as they began. She watched Kalen fight with a focus that seemed to burn through every ounce of the cold control he showed in public. Something fierce and unguarded finally allowed to surface. She understood, watching him, that this was not really about a territorial dispute at all. This was about something he had been holding back for weeks, something that had finally found an outlet it could not contain any longer. The fight went on longer than Elena expected, both men clearly skilled, clearly evenly matched in a way that made the outcome genuinely uncertain. She watched with her heart in her throat, as Garrett landed a solid blow that sent Kalen staggering back, and she had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from crying out. She watched Kalen recover, driven by something that looked less like strategy and more like sheer refusal to accept defeat, and press forward, with a renewed intensity, that finally, after several more exchanges, brought the duel to its end. Kalen won, though the victory left him bloodied and breathing hard, one arm held carefully against his ribs, a deep cut along his jaw that had not yet stopped bleeding. Garrett, defeated, but not seriously harmed, extended a hand in the formal gesture of acknowledgement that the old customs required. Well fought, Your Majesty, Garrett said, and though his voice was tight with the discomfort of defeat, there was no bitterness in it. I concede the boundary dispute. Kalen accepted the handshake, his jaw tight, and then turned away as the small crowd began to disperse, healers moving forward to check on both men. He waved off the healer who approached him, insisting he was fine, though the blood still trickling from the cut along his jaw suggested otherwise. Elena pushed through the thinning crowd before she had fully decided to do so, arriving in front of him with her hands trembling, whether from cold or from something else entirely she could not have said. "You are bleeding," she said, her voice unsteady. "It is nothing," Kalen said, echoing the same dismissive words he had used the night before at the ball, though this time his voice carried a rawness that made the lie sound thin, even to his own ears. "Stop saying that," Elena said, and to her own surprise, her eyes had filled with tears she had not given herself permission to shed. "Stop pretending everything is nothing when it is clearly not nothing at all. You just fought a duel over a boundary dispute that I do not believe existed for one single second before last night. Tell me the truth, Kalen, please. I am done guessing." He stared at her for a long moment, blood still seeping slowly from the cut along his jaw, his chest still rising and falling hard from the exertion of the fight, and something in his expression finally began to crack open. "Not here," he said quietly, glancing around at the last few stragglers still lingering near the training grounds. "Come with me." He led her to a small private chamber near the healer's quarters, waving away the healer who tried to follow, insisting on privacy, with a tone that brooked no argument. Once the door closed behind them, he sat heavily on the edge of a wooden bench, allowing the exhaustion of the fight to show on his face for the first time. "There is no boundary dispute," he admitted, his voice rough. "There never was." "Then why?" Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Kalen was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own bloodied knuckles. "Because I watched you dance with him and laugh with him, and something in me could not bear it. I told myself for weeks that the distance I kept from you was purely for your protection, that reassigning every man who showed you kindness was simply prudent caution. Last night, watching you with Cole, I understood I had been lying to myself. It was never only about protection. I could not stand the sight of another man making you happy when I have spent every single day since my coronation wanting to be the one who does." Elena felt her breath catch. The room suddenly very quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire in the small hearth. "Then why did you reject me? Why did you humiliate me in front of your entire pack, if that is how you feel?" Kalen finally looked up, and the raw honesty in his eyes struck her harder than anything he had said so far. "Because the Drake pack has sworn to destroy any confirmed mate of the Voss bloodline. My father's own mate, my mother, was killed by Drake assassins when I was a boy, precisely because she was known to be his weakness, his one vulnerability they could exploit. I rejected the bond in front of the entire pack, because I hoped, if enough people believed you meant nothing to me, the Drakes might never think to use you against me, the way they used my mother against my father." Elena sat down slowly on the bench beside him, the pieces of the past weeks finally, painfully, falling into place. "That is why the guards, that is why every man who grew close to me disappeared within days. I told myself I was protecting you," Kalen said quietly. "But standing here now, I understand Silas was right. I was not protecting you at all. I was only protecting myself from the fear of losing you, the way my father lost my mother, and in doing so, I made you feel unwanted and alone in a castle I should have made feel like a home." Elena stared at him, this proud, careful king who had just laid himself bare in a way she suspected he had never done for another living soul, and felt something in her own chest, something that had been clenched tight with hurt and confusion for weeks, begin, slowly, to loosen. The truth Kalen had finally spoken did not erase the weeks of hurt and confusion Elena had carried since the coronation, and she told him so, plainly, sitting beside him in the quiet chamber with the fire slowly dying in the hearth. "I understand why you were afraid," she said. "I even understand, now that you have explained it, why you thought pushing everyone away might keep me safe. But Kalen, you made that choice for me without ever once asking what I wanted. You decided I could not be trusted with the truth, that I needed to be protected through secrecy rather than honesty, and all that decision did was leave me alone and confused in a castle full of strangers, wondering why the one person whose opinion of me seemed to matter most had decided I was not worth an explanation. Kaelin absorbed this without flinching, though she could see the words land, could see him accepting the weight of them rather than deflecting as he had done so many times before. You are right, he said quietly. I told myself I was being strong, protecting you the way a king protects his pack, through decisive action rather than vulnerable words. But strength built on hiding the truth from the person it is meant to protect is not really strength at all. It is only fear, dressed up in a crown. Elena studied him for a long moment. This man who had just fought a duel and bled for a lie he had constructed to hide a truth he was only now brave enough to admit. What happens now, Kaelin? If the Drake pack truly intends to hunt down any confirmed mate of your bloodline, has anything actually changed? Am I any safer today than I was yesterday, simply because you have finally told me the truth? No, Kaelin admitted. If anything, the danger has only grown. Word of the duel will travel fast, and any wolf paying close attention already suspects what drove me to challenge Cole so suddenly over a boundary dispute that barely existed. The Drakes have spies in half the packs of this region. It is only a matter of time before they hear the rumors and draw the same conclusions everyone at that ball likely already has. Then hiding was never going to work, Elena said. Not really, not forever. No, Kaelin agreed, his voice heavy. I think some part of me always knew that. I think I simply could not face the alternative, which was accepting the bond openly and living every day with the terror of losing you, the way my father lost my mother. Elena reached out, hesitant at first, and rested her hand over his where it lay on the bench between them, careful of the bruised and bloodied knuckles from the duel. He went very still at her touch, as though afraid that any sudden movement might make her pull away. I cannot promise you that accepting this bond, if that is even what I choose to do, would mean nothing bad could ever happen to me, she said carefully. No one can promise that, not even a king, but I can tell you that being kept in the dark, being protected through secrecy and distance, has not made me feel safe these past weeks, Kaelin. It has made me feel small and unwanted and confused. If you truly want to protect me, I think the answer is not less honesty. I think it is more. Kaelin turned his hand beneath hers, gently lacing his fingers through her own, a small gesture that felt, in the quiet of that chamber, larger than any grand declaration he might have made in front of his entire pack. Then I will not hide from you again, he said. Whatever comes, whatever danger the Drakes bring to our door, I will face it with you knowing the full truth, rather than trying to shield you from a threat you deserve to understand. Silas found them there sometime later, the fire nearly out, their hands still joined on the bench between them, and something in his weathered face eased at the sight, the particular relief of a man who had watched a stubborn young king finally stumble his way toward wisdom. I take it the conversation went well, Silas said dryly. Better than I deserved, Kaelin admitted. Good, Silas said, because I received word this morning, before the sun had even fully risen, that a Drake scouting party was spotted along the northern border 2 days ago. I did not want to interrupt the duel with the news, but I think, given everything, you both deserve to know the danger is no longer a distant possibility. It is already here. The warmth of the moment before cooled instantly into something sharper and more urgent. Elena felt Kaelin's grip tighten around her hand, felt the shift in him from a man finally allowing himself vulnerability to a king recalculating threats and defenses in real time. How close to the border? Kaelin asked, his voice already hardening back into command. Close enough that I do not believe it was a coincidence, Silas said grimly. I believe, Your Majesty, that the Drakes already suspect what happened at your coronation, regardless of your rejection in front of the pack. I believe they have been watching this castle for weeks, waiting to see whether the rumors were true. Elena felt a cold thread of fear work its way through her chest, but beneath it, something steadier had taken root, something that had not been there in the weeks of confusion and secrecy that preceded this moment. She was frightened, yes, but she was no longer alone in that fear, no longer left to guess at shadows and half-explained rumors. Whatever came next, she would face it with the truth in hand rather than the darkness of ignorance, and somehow, that made all the difference. Then we prepare, Kalen said, rising to his feet, still holding Elena's hand, as though he had no intention of letting go. Together, this time. No more secrets, Silas. Whatever plans we make from this point forward, Elena is part of them. Silas glanced between the two of them, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his weathered mouth. "It is about time, Your Majesty," he said. "It is about time." In the days that followed, Silver Ridge transformed around Elena in ways she had not thought possible. Kalen called a war council that same afternoon, and for the first time since her arrival at the castle, Elena found herself seated at the table rather than standing at the edges of decisions made about her, without her input. The Drake scouting party was seen retreating back across the border by nightfall, Nolan reported, spreading a worn map across the table. But scouting parties do not simply wander close to a rival territory for no reason. I believe they were testing our patrol response times, learning our patterns before committing to anything larger. "How long before they move again?" Kalen asked. "Impossible to say with certainty," Nolan admitted. "Could be days. Could be weeks. The Drakes have never been a pack that rushes into conflict without careful planning. If they believe you have taken a mate, Your Majesty, they will want to strike when the opportunity offers the greatest advantage, not simply the soonest one." Elena listened to the exchange with a growing understanding of the world she had stepped into, a world of careful strategy and generational conflict that stretched back long before she had ever arrived at Silver Ridge. She thought of the healer's words on the night of the coronation, the murmur of mate rippling through the crowd, and understood now how much weight that single word carried, how it had transformed her, in the eyes of an enemy pack, from an anonymous outside aid into a target worth planning an attack around. "I want to help," she said, and every head at the table turned toward her. Kalen's expression softened, though a flicker of protective worry remained visible beneath it. "Elena, I do not doubt your courage, but you have no training in pack defense, no experience with—" "Then teach me," she said firmly. "You told me yourself, no more secrets, no more decisions made about my safety without my input. I am not asking to lead a patrol into Drake territory, Kalen. I am asking to understand what is happening around me, and to have some ability to protect myself, rather than sitting in my quarters waiting to become a liability someone else has to defend." Nolan, to Elena's surprise, nodded approvingly. "She has a point, Your Majesty. An informed, capable person is far less of a risk than a frightened, ignorant one. I have trained plenty of betas who came into combat readiness later than most. It can be done, given time and dedication." Kalen studied Elena for a long moment, and she watched him wage some internal battle between the instinct to shield her from every possible danger and the promise he had made only days earlier to treat her as a true partner rather than a secret to be managed. Finally he nodded, though the reluctance was still visible in the tight set of his jaw. "Nolan will oversee your training personally," Kalen said. "Basic defense, situational awareness, enough that you are never as helpless as the Drakes might assume a human aid to be. But Elena, I need you to understand. This does not mean I will stop worrying about your safety. It only means I will stop trying to solve that worry by keeping you in the dark." Elena felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips, the first real lightness she had felt since the War Council began. "That is all I am asking, Kalen." Over the following weeks, Elena split her days between the steward's office, where her administrative work continued, and the training yard, where Nolan proved a patient, though demanding teacher. She learned to read the terrain around the castle, to recognize the signs of an unfamiliar scent or an out-of-place sound. To defend herself with a short blade Nolan insisted every person in the castle should know how to use regardless of rank. She was not becoming a warrior, not in any sense that would have impressed the seasoned fighters of Silver Ridge, but she was becoming someone capable, someone who understood the shape of the danger around her, rather than fearing it blindly. Her relationship with Kalen deepened alongside her training, no longer shadowed by the careful distance and cold formality of the early weeks. He sought her out in quiet moments, walked with her through the same gardens where she had once laughed with Desmond, told her stories of his childhood, of his mother before the Drakes had taken her, of the weight of a crown he had inherited far younger than he had ever expected to carry it. She found, to her own surprise, that the careful, guarded king she had first met was also capable of a warmth and openness that felt, once fully offered, like nothing she had ever experienced before. "I never properly apologized," Kaelin said one evening, as they walked together beneath a sky just beginning to darken into twilight, "for the coronation, for the way I rejected you in front of everyone. Whatever my reasons, you deserved better than public humiliation." "You have apologized," Elena said gently, "many times over, in many different ways, these past weeks. I think what matters now is not dwelling on that night, but building something better from here forward." Kaelin stopped walking and turned to face her fully, something serious and searching in his expression. "Is that what you want, Elena? Something built forward, between us? I would not blame you if the answer were no. I have given you very little reason to trust me, and a great deal of reason to walk away and build a life somewhere far from Silver Ridge and everything it has cost you." Elena considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer, not a hurried reassurance offered simply to ease his obvious worry. She thought of the fear she had felt the night of the coronation, the confusion of the weeks that followed, the slow unraveling of a truth that had, once finally spoken, changed everything between them. She thought, too, of the man who had bled in a duel rather than watch her dance with someone else, who had finally chosen honesty over the comfortable armor of silence, who was standing before her now, asking rather than assuming, giving her the choice he had denied her at the coronation. "Yes," she said simply. "That is exactly what I want." The relief that broke across his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and complete, and when he reached for her hand this time, there was no hesitation in either of them. The peace did not last as long as any of them had hoped. 3 weeks after the War Council, a runner arrived at the castle gates at dawn, exhausted and wild-eyed, carrying news that scattered the calm Silver Ridge had settled into, like leaves in a sudden wind. "Drake wolves, Your Majesty," the runner gasped, still catching his breath from the hard ride. "A large group, moving fast along the northern trail. They will reach the border by nightfall if their pace holds." The castle transformed within the hour, the quiet rhythm of daily life replaced by the organized urgency of a pack preparing for conflict. Nolan directed patrol assignments with brisk efficiency. Guards moved supplies and weapons with practiced speed, and Kaelin disappeared into his study with Silas for nearly an hour, emerging with a face set in the hard, focused lines Elena recognized as his war expression, the mask he wore when the crown's full weight settled onto his shoulders. "I want you in the castle's inner chamber," Kaelin told her, finding her in the training yard where she had been reviewing defensive positions with Nolan. "It is the most secure location we have, reinforced walls, a single defensible entrance, guards posted at all times." "I understand the strategy," Elena said carefully, "but I want to help, Kaelin. Not lead the defense. I know my limits, but I can assist with communication between positions, or help the healers prepare for casualties, or—" "Elena." Kaelin's voice was rough, with a fear he was clearly trying to keep contained. "This is not a training exercise. This is the Drake Pack, wolves who killed my mother, without hesitation, because she represented exactly what you represent to me now. I cannot lose you to prove a point about partnership. Please, for tonight, let me know you are somewhere safe." Elena heard the raw fear beneath his authority, understood it was not control speaking now, but genuine terror for her safety, and found a compromise she could offer without abandoning the promise they had made to each other weeks earlier. "The inner chamber, then. But I want real information as the situation develops, not silence and guesswork while I wait behind reinforced walls with no idea what is happening to the people I care about." Kaelin exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her willingness to bend, even slightly. "I can promise you that much." As dusk fell over Silver Ridge, the Drake wolves crossed the northern border in greater numbers than the scouting report had suggested, a coordinated force clearly intent on more than simple intimidation. Kaelin led the defense personally, positioned at the front line where the pack's borders met the encroaching threat, his focus narrowed entirely to the immediate task of protecting his territory and everyone within it. The confrontation that followed was tense and chaotic, wolves clashing along the tree line in the fading light, Nolan's carefully drilled patrols holding formation against an enemy force that had clearly come prepared for exactly this kind of engagement. Elena, waiting in the inner chamber with a young runner Kaelin had assigned to keep her updated, felt every minute stretch unbearably long, the distant sounds of conflict carrying faintly on the wind even through the castle's thick walls. "They are pushing hard along the eastern flank," the runner reported, breathless from relaying messages between the chamber and the outer walls. "His Majesty has moved to reinforce the position personally." Elena's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to remain steady, remembering everything Nolan had taught her these past weeks, remembering that panic helped no one, least of all the man fighting to protect everything she had come to love about her new home. She helped the healers who had gathered in an adjoining chamber prepare bandages and supplies, her hands staying busy even as her mind remained fixed on the distant sounds of battle beyond the walls. The fighting lasted well into the night, before word finally came that the Drake forces had been pushed back across the border, their coordinated assault broken by the disciplined defense Nolan and Kaelin had organized. Elena did not wait for permission before rushing from the inner chamber toward the courtyard, where the returning defenders were gathering, her heart pounding with a fear that did not ease, until she saw Kaelin among them, exhausted and bearing several fresh injuries, but alive and standing. "Kaelin," she called, pushing through the gathered crowd of returning wolves without any concern for propriety or protocol. He turned at the sound of her voice, and whatever exhaustion weighed on him seemed to lift for just a moment at the sight of her running toward him. He caught her as she reached him, holding her close, despite the injuries that made him wince at the contact, neither of them caring in that moment about anything except the simple, overwhelming relief of the other's safety. "You are hurt," Elena said, pulling back just enough to examine the cuts and bruises visible even in the torchlight. "Nothing the healers cannot manage," Kaelin said, though his voice was rough with exhaustion. "The important thing is that Silver Ridge held. The Drakes retreated, with heavier losses than they anticipated. I do not believe they expected our defenses to hold as firmly as they did." "How many did we lose?" Elena asked quietly, dreading the answer. "3 wolves," Kaelin said, his expression grim. "Good soldiers, all of them. We will honor them properly once the immediate danger has passed. But Elena, we held the border. Silver Ridge is safe, at least for tonight." Elena felt tears she had been holding back throughout the long, terrifying night finally spill over, grief for the fallen mixing with overwhelming relief that the man standing in front of her, the man she had come to love despite every obstacle placed between them, had survived the night intact. "I am done watching you fight from a distance," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears. "Whatever comes next, Kaelin, we face it together. I meant that promise, and I am not taking it back simply because tonight was frightening." Kaelin pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, exhaustion and love mingling in the gesture. "Together," he agreed, "for whatever comes next." In the aftermath of the border conflict, Silver Ridge entered a careful, watchful calm, the kind of quiet that came not from true peace, but from an enemy regrouping after an unexpected defeat. Kaelin spent long hours with Nolan and Silas, reviewing patrol patterns, strengthening border defenses, sending careful diplomatic feelers to neighboring packs, who might be willing to formalize alliances against a Drake threat that clearly had not given up its ambitions simply because one assault had failed. Elena found her own role within these preparations growing steadily, no longer confined to administrative work or basic defensive training. Her careful mind for organization, honed through months of managing the steward's records, proved unexpectedly valuable in coordinating the complex logistics of strengthened border patrols, tracking supply movements, and managing the flow of information between Silver Ridge and the neighboring packs Kaelin hoped to bring into alliance. "You have a talent for this," Nolan told her one afternoon, reviewing a patrol schedule she had reorganized to close several gaps in coverage that had gone unnoticed for weeks. "Most outsiders take years to understand pack logistics this thoroughly. You have managed it in a matter of months." "I had good reason to learn quickly," Elena said, though the compliment warmed her more than she let on. The growing respect she earned within Silver Ridge extended beyond the War Council and the training yard. The pack itself, which had watched her public rejection at the coronation with a mixture of pity and suspicion, had slowly come to see her differently in the months since. Word of her role in the border defense preparations spread through the castle, along with quieter stories, the way she had helped the healers through the long night of the attack, the way she had insisted on training rather than hiding, the way the Alpha King's guarded, careful heart had visibly softened in her presence. Ivy, delighted by the transformation she had watched unfold over the months since Elena's arrival, could not resist teasing her about it during one quiet afternoon in Elena's quarters. "You know, miss, half the castle placed wagers on how long it would take His Majesty to finally claim you properly. I believe Oren the cook is owed quite a bit of coin from several guards who bet it would happen sooner." Elena laughed, genuinely delighted despite the gentle embarrassment of being the subject of castle gossip. "I did not realize my personal life had become a source of entertainment for the entire kitchen staff." "Miss, your personal life has been the entertainment of this entire castle since the night of the coronation," Ivy said, grinning. "Though I think most of us are simply relieved it seems to be heading toward a happier ending than that first terrible night suggested." That evening, Kaelin found Elena in the castle's small library, reviewing correspondence from a neighboring pack that had finally agreed, after weeks of careful negotiation, to formalize a defensive alliance against future Drake aggression. He watched her from the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him, something soft and unguarded in his expression that he no longer bothered to hide from her. "The alliance with the Ashford pack is confirmed," Elena said, looking up with a smile. "Their delegate sent word this afternoon. They will send a formal envoy within the week to finalize the terms." "That is largely thanks to your careful diplomacy," Kaelin said, crossing the room to join her. "I do not think Ashford would have moved so quickly toward alliance without the trust you built with their delegate over these past weeks." "We built it together," Elena corrected gently. "I only handled the correspondence. You are the one who convinced them Silver Ridge was worth the risk of formal commitment." Kaelin settled into the chair beside her, and for a while they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the quiet companionship that had grown between them over the months since the border attack, a partnership built on honesty and shared purpose rather than the careful distance that had defined their earliest days together. "I have been thinking," Kaelin said eventually, breaking the silence, "about the coronation, about the way I rejected you in front of the entire pack, and everything that followed from that single choice. Kaelin, we have talked through that many times already." "I know," he said gently. "This is not another apology, though I do not think I will ever stop being sorry for how that night unfolded. This is something different. I want to correct it, properly, in front of the pack, the way it should have happened from the beginning, if fear had not driven my choices that night." Elena felt her breath catch, understanding immediately what he meant, though he had not yet said the words directly. "Kaelin, are you asking?" "I am asking if you will allow me to claim you properly," Kaelin said, taking her hand in both of his own, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability so clearly visible in his eyes. "Not through fear and secrecy this time, but openly, before the entire pack, exactly as it should have happened the night I first laid eyes on you. I love you, Elena. I have loved you since that very first moment, even when fear made me push you away instead of pulling you close. I do not want to hide that truth any longer, from you or from anyone else." Elena felt tears gathering, though this time they carried none of the grief and confusion of the coronation night, only overwhelming joy at the completion of a journey that had begun so painfully but had led them, through honesty and shared courage, to this quiet moment in the library. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Kaelin, I want that too." The Drake pack still loomed as a threat beyond Silver Ridge's borders. The alliance with Ashford still needed finalizing, and countless challenges surely waited in the months ahead. But sitting together in the quiet library, hands joined, hearts finally open to each other without reservation, Elena felt, for the first time since arriving at Silver Ridge, that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The great hall of Silver Ridge had been transformed once again, silver banners freshly hung, candles lit in every corner, the entire pack gathered in the same space where, months earlier, Kaelin had turned his back on the woman fate had chosen for him. This time, the mood in the hall carried none of the confusion and pity of that first night. Word had spread quickly through the castle and beyond, carried by delighted staff and curious delegates alike, that the Alpha King intended to correct the mistake of his coronation, and the pack had gathered eagerly to witness it. Elena stood near the edge of the dais, dressed in deep green fabric that Ivy had insisted was perfect for the occasion, her hands trembling slightly with a nervousness that had nothing to do with fear this time, only the weight of a moment she had never truly expected to arrive at, not after the humiliation of the coronation, not after weeks of confusion and careful, painful honesty that had slowly rebuilt what fear had nearly destroyed. Kalen stood before the assembled pack, dressed in the same ceremonial black and silver he had worn the night of his coronation, though the man wearing it now bore little resemblance to the guarded, frightened king who had turned away from his mate in that same hall. He met Elena's eyes across the distance between them, and this time, there was no hesitation in his expression, no internal battle visible behind carefully controlled features. Only certainty, warm and unguarded, offered freely to the woman he loved, and to the pack he ruled. Months ago, in this very hall, Kalen began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, I made a choice that I have regretted every day since. I rejected the bond fate offered me, not because my heart did not recognize Elena Marsh as my mate the moment I first saw her, but because fear convinced me that pushing her away might protect her from dangers I was not yet ready to face openly. A murmur moved through the crowd, though this time it carried none of the pity or confusion of the coronation night, only rapt attention as their king continued. I was wrong, Kalen said simply. Protection built on secrecy and distance is not protection at all. It is only fear, and fear nearly cost me the one thing that has come to matter more to me than my crown, more than my own careful control, more than any strategy I convinced myself was wisdom rather than cowardice. Elena stood beside me through a duel I fought for reasons I refuse to name, through a border conflict that tested every defense this pack has ever built, through months of rebuilding trust that I broke with my own hand on the very night I should have claimed her instead. He crossed the distance between them then, taking her hands in his own, before the entire assembled pack, and Elena felt the weight of hundreds of watching eyes settle on her, no longer with pity, but with something that felt, remarkably, like genuine warmth and celebration. Elena Marsh, Kalen said, his voice steady and clear, I claim you now, openly, before my pack and before every soul gathered in this hall, exactly as I should have done from the very first moment fate brought us together. Not out of fear, and not out of secrecy, but out of a love I have carried since that first heartbeat when our eyes met across this very room, a love I am no longer willing to hide from anyone, least of all you. Elena felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, though she made no effort to hide them this time, standing tall before the pack that had watched her humiliation months earlier, and now witnessed something entirely different unfolding in its place. I accept the bond, she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion thick in her throat. Fully, openly, and without hesitation, whatever comes next, whatever the Drakes or any other threat brings to our door, I choose to face it standing beside you, Kalen Voss, not hidden away for my own protection, but as your equal and your partner in every sense. The hall erupted into celebration, the pack's approval roaring through the space with a warmth entirely different from the uncertain murmurs of the coronation night. Kalen pulled Elena close, and when their bond finally, fully solidified before the eyes of the entire pack, she felt none of the fear that had haunted the months since her arrival at Silver Ridge, only a deep, settled certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. Later that evening, as the celebration continued in the Great Hall, Kalen found a quiet moment alone with Elena, on the same balcony where, months earlier, he had watched her walk through the gardens with Desmond, jealousy and fear driving him to quietly dismantle every friendship she attempted to build. Now, standing beside her as his openly claimed mate, he felt only gratitude for how far they had traveled since that painful beginning. Do you regret any of it? Kalen asked quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky over Silver Ridge. The rejection, the months of secrecy, everything that made this journey so much harder than it needed to be. Elena considered the question seriously, leaning into his side as his arms settled around her shoulders. I regret the pain, she said honestly. I regret the weeks I spent confused and hurt, wondering why the man who claimed to care nothing for me seemed determined to control every corner of my life. But I do not regret where we arrived, Kaelin. I think, in a strange way, everything we survived together, the duel, the border attack, the slow rebuilding of trust, made what we have now stronger than if it had come easily from the very beginning. Kaelin pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, the crown of Silver Ridge resting easier on his shoulders than it had in months, finally free of the secrets that had weighed on him since his coronation. The Drakes are still out there, he said quietly. This peace will not last forever. There will be more battles ahead, more danger, more challenges neither of us can fully predict. I know, Elena said, meeting his eyes with a steady certainty that had grown in her since the night of the border attack, since the months of training and partnership that had transformed her from a frightened outsider into a woman capable of standing beside a king without flinching from whatever came next. But this time, whatever comes, we face it together, with the truth between us, instead of secrets. That is enough for me, Kaelin. That is more than enough. Below them, the celebration continued long into the night, the great hall of Silver Ridge filled with music and laughter, and the warm, settled joy of a pack that had watched its king finally claim the mate fate had chosen for him, not through fear this time, but through a hard-won honesty that had turned a painful beginning into a love story the entire castle would remember for generations to come.